Len now wants to find out what life was like for his great-great-grandfather James and his 11 children. He's come to the London School of Economics in central London. He's meeting archivist Sue Donnelly, who looks after the Charles Booth collection.
Hi, nice to meet you. Let's go up the stairs.
It's an archive that records living conditions in the capital in the late 19th century, when James Eldridge was living in Bethnal Green.
Tell me who Charles Booth was exactly,
right.
what he did. I've heard of him, but I always get him confused with the Salvation Army Booth.
You're not the only one. Charles Booth was a 19th century businessman who got very interested in why there was so much poverty in London, in effectively the richest city in the world. So he went out and he collected lots of information about rents, about wages, about sizes of families, and he then created these colour-coded maps looking at each street and working out the levels of poverty and wealth in different areas, what he called the social condition of an area. So what we have here is the Bethnal Green area in the late 19th century. And the thing to note from this coding at the bottom is that red and pink are fairly affluent areas, and as you move into blues and dark blues and eventually black, the area in the street becomes poorer. And at this time, Bethnal Green was officially the poorest area in London. It was the poorest area.
Right.
It had the densest population, both in terms of the numbers of people who were crammed into individual houses and the number of houses that were crammed onto the space available.
Bethnal Green lies about 2 miles northeast of the City of London. It was once a rural retreat for wealthy Londoners and was seen as an attractive escape from the hustle and bustle of the city. But as London expanded in the 18th century, Bethnal Green's open spaces were swallowed up by industry and housing. The construction of the railways in the 1840s led to the demolition of thousands of houses, causing acute overcrowding. By the time James was living there, it was one of the most densely populated areas of Britain. It was not uncommon to have more than 10 people living in one house.
So my great-great-grandfather was in Camden Street.
Right, okay, so we've got Bethnal Green Road
I can see it here, look, clear as a
go.
bell. And that's blue, which, according to your scale of poverty, is pretty low.
Yeah, Booth described it as being an area and a street that was in chronic want.
Chronic want. Well, that sums it all up, doesn't it? Not only are we in one of the poorest area in London, we're in one of the most run-down and poorest streets in the poorest area of London.
Absolutely. This is pretty much the bottom of the pile.
Yeah.
And actually, we have got some photographs of the area from about the same period.
And when you look at the conditions that these people lived in, and you think of my great-great-grandfather, James, with 11 children, and they're stuck in one of these tiny little houses, it's just amazing that anyone almost survived.
Yeah.
You know,
yes.
it's
I mean,
terrible.
life expectancy was very low.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly for children and older people.
At the time James was living in Bethnal Green, life there was a struggle. 1 in every 5 babies died before they reached their first birthday. And for many of those that did survive, conditions were hard. Almost half of the population in Bethnal Green lived below the subsistence level. Outbreaks of diseases like cholera and smallpox added to the mounting difficulties faced by the locals.
So we have another piece of research that relates to your family's history from one of the local newspapers. So.
This is the Eastern Argus and Borough of Hackney Times, Saturday, September the 14th, 1889. Suicide in Bethnal Green Road between death and the workhouse. Week in, week out, we have the melancholy duty to record sudden surprises of suicide mania in our very midst, and a case took place in Bethnal Green Road this week. On Sunday morning, Police Constable Gerard proceeded to number 2 Camden Street, where he found a man hanging by the neck from the lintel of the door of the WC. I can read that. The body was identified as that of James Eldridge, aged 69, a widower who had been well known in the parish, where formerly he carried on business as a builder. Competition and business reverses, however, appears to have reduced him to such a low ebb that it is alleged he was shortly to have become an inmate in the Bethnal Green workhouse. It's bloody hopeless, isn't it? And the fear of this step is thought to have been the reason for his sacrifice in his own life. The jury ultimately returned a verdict of suicide by hanging while in a state of temporary insanity. So that was my great-great-grandfather.
Yeah.
So I suppose his wife had passed away, my great-great-grandmother. He was living alone.
Yeah. His children are now married and struggling to keep their own families together.
Right.
There's no pension.
He's worried about paying the rent.
No. And he doesn't want to go into the workhouse, which is the only other option.
And there he is, virtually 70 years old, and the only escape is to tie a rope around the blooming outside toilet and stand on a chair and, you know, it's beyond sad, you know, it's so terrible, really. It's so sad.
My overriding feeling is one of sadness. The fact that Bethnal Green was the poorest area of London. There was no quality of life. They were just struggling day in, day out, just to put food on the table and feed their families. And to realise that James Eldridge would prefer to commit suicide than go into a workhouse makes me wonder how bad these workhouses were. And really, that's what I would like to find out now, exactly what a workhouse was and why everyone was so petrified to have to enter them.